Late Victorian London glittered with gaslight and moral strictures, and at its center stood Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, the era's most celebrated aesthete. By 1895, he was already famous for The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1890, and a string of brilliant comedies, Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892, A Woman of No Importance, 1893, and the recently premiered An Ideal Husband, January 3, 1895. His epigrams and voice had made him a household name in Mayfair salons and on Fleet Street. Wilde's life was entangled with Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Bosie, a mercurial young aristocrat whose passionate, often volatile relationship with Wilde inflamed gossip and jealousy. Bosie's father, John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry, regarded the liaison as a disgrace and launched a merciless vendetta. In February 1895, Queensberry left a calling card at the Albemarle Club accusing Wilde of posing as a sodomite, a provocation that led Wilde to sue the Marquess for criminal libel. Those legal stakes were not abstract. The Labouchere Amendment to the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 had made all male homosexual acts a crime of gross indecency, a phrase that gave detectives and prosecutors wide latitude to pursue men regardless of private consent. The public mood in London had turned unforgiving. Newspapers that once toasted Wilde now sniffed scandal. Magistrates were eager to display moral firmness, and the Metropolitan Police, under Inspector Donald Swanson, were primed to act. By choosing to litigate a personal slander, Wilde risked falling into the very statutory ambush Queensberry had set. The stage was set. A brilliant wit up against a vengeful peer, a whispered vice made criminal by statute, and a city ready to pass harsh judgment. That fraught collision erupted in April and May of 1895, as prosecutors, witnesses, and intimate letters were dragged into the harsh light of the courts and changed Wilde's life. In February 1895, at the Albemarle Club in Mayfair, John Sholto Douglas, 9th Marquess of Queensberry, left a calling card addressed to Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde that read, in the notorious misspelling, for Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite. That single piece of pasteboard turned a private feud into a legal provocation. Wilde, already the nation's most dazzling wit and dramatist, did not ignore the affront. He chose to sue the Marquess for criminal libel, believing a public vindication would restore his honor and silence the calumny. The choice was at once theatrical and perilous. The Labouchere Amendment of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, 1885, made gross indecency a prosecutable offense between men, and any courtroom scrutiny could drag private intimacies into the open. Nevertheless, Wilde moved with characteristic flamboyance. He summoned counsel, instructed solicitors, and rehearsed the narrative he intended to present, that a great artist and public figure could not be defamed with impunity. He imagined the courthouse as another stage and himself as the immaculate protagonist who would expose Queensberry as a spiteful bully. Newspapers sensed the contradiction and rushed in. Maybe clicking subscribe would have saved them. Fleet Street columns that had once lauded his epigrams and comedies now catalogued scandal. The Pall Mall Gazette and several daily papers printed the card and parsed its implications, while caricaturists sketched a duel between aestheticism and aristocratic fury. Public opinion began to harden. Salons that had applauded the importance of being earnest muttered about propriety, and the Metropolitan Police, already alert to vice investigations, quietly took note. Wilde's supporters rallied. Friends, actors, and literary allies offered depositions and social testimony, and his legal team compiled witness lists intended to discredit Queensberry's motive and demonstrate malicious intent. Behind the calm of rehearsed irony, anxiety tightened. Wilde knew sensitive correspondence existed with Lord Alfred Douglas and understood that Queensberry's defense of justification could legally compel disclosure. The moment for litigation had been chosen deliberately, but the choice also carried the precise danger Queensberry hoped to provoke. By making libel the central issue, Wilde invited forensic scrutiny of intimacy in an era that legislated morality. The early press storm turned a family quarrel into a public trial. the Albemarle card becoming a detonator. Momentum gathered toward a larger collision. Queensberry's counter-strategy and the state's readiness to investigate would soon transform Wilde from a defendant in reputation to a defendant before the law, setting the scene for the fraught hearings and arrests that would follow in April 1895. The Marquess of Queensberry's defense quietly turned Wilde's theatrical gambit into a forensic inquest. The case stopped being a contest of epigrams and became an excavation of private life. The Marquess's legal team invoked the plea of justification to prove the truth of the accusation, which opened the door to compel testimony and documents. Metropolitan detectives and private investigators began to comb Wilde's circle. Inspector Donald Swanson of Scotland Yard took a systematic interest, and the Metropolitan Police traced witnesses and papers that might corroborate the Marquess's charge. Intimate letters between Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas, plainly incriminating in tone, emerged as the most combustible material. Drafts and copies moved from Bosey's custody and from friends into solicitors' hands and ultimately into court papers. Newspapers that had once lavished Wilde with picturesque adjectives now printed extracts with sensational relish, and Fleet Street fed a growing public appetite for particulars. As testimony accumulated, sympathy shifted. Aristocratic salons that had applauded decadence recoiled when transcribed passion and discreet rendezvous appeared in legal documents. Wilde's legal advisors recognized belatedly the danger of discovery. When the defense signaled it would call witnesses and produce letters to justify the slur, the libel suit's tenor changed irrevocably. Under that strain, Wilde took desperate measures to protect his reputation and his correspondence, but English procedure favored disclosure over discretion. The prosecution that followed found its evidential seeds in these disclosures: hotel bills, address books, and the names of young men and servants who could be summoned to recount meetings. Public testimony and printed extracts narrowed the rhetorical space in which Wilde had hoped to stand as an aesthetic martyr. The Albemarle Club card, once a singular affront, now sat amid a constellation of corroborative detail that Queensberry's advocates marshaled with relentless pedantry. By early April 1895, the case had metastasized from insult to indictment. Wilde's decision to sue exposed a lattice of contacts and confessions, police interest hardened into investigatory action, and the press, having smelled a revelation, prepared to catalog every deposition. That momentum carried the proceedings toward a criminal stage, converting the theatrical spectacle of the libel battle into the juridical machinery of prosecution and setting the scene for Wilde's arrest on April 6, 1895, and the ordeals that followed at the Central Criminal Court. When Queensberry's counsel made it clear he would plead justification and produce witnesses and correspondence, Wilde's libel action began to unravel. The carefully staged courtroom theater Wilde had imagined dissolved into procedural reality, and he withdrew the prosecution rather than risk intimate letters being entered into evidence. That withdrawal did not end the matter. It invited the state to step in. Metropolitan detectives, armed with extracts and memoranda Queensberry's team had compiled, pressed the case forward. Inspector Donald Swanson's files and the police notebooks that Fleet Street would later feast on were already detailing meetings, hotel names and dates, and a network of young men whose testimony might bear on the charge of gross indecency. On April 6, 1895, officers of the Metropolitan Police arrested Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, acting on that accumulating dossier and the public imperative to enforce the Labouchere Amendment. The arrest was precise and public. He was taken into custody, charged with acts the 1885 statute had criminalized, and the celebrated wit was processed like any accused man. The openings of the criminal prosecutions were procedural but savage in consequence. Prosecutors framed counts of gross indecency, and the press, which had already printed the Albemarle Club card and letter extracts, relished the particulars. Courtroom battles that followed were stripped of Wilde's ornamentation. No epigram could turn aside a question about a date, a lodging, or a ledger entry. The first criminal trial at the Central Criminal Court proved inconclusive. Juries hesitated in the face of conflicting testimony, and an early hearing in April 1895 failed to deliver a unanimous verdict, but the pause only tightened the vice. Each adjournment allowed fresh affidavits, additional witnesses to be traced, and hotel books and servants' statements to be examined under oath. Friends and patrons who had once praised Wilde's flamboyant prose and theatricality began to retreat. Social invitations ceased, editors toned down encomia, and some who had written supportive letters declined to repeat those sentiments under cross-examination. Financial strain followed. Legal costs mounted, performances were canceled or cooled, and Wilde's capacity to fight on diminished. The legal net narrowed with bureaucratic certainty as police lists, signed depositions, and newspaper reports converted gossip into evidentiary momentum. By late April and into May 1895, Wilde was a man in custody awaiting retrial, his theatrical confidence replaced by a reserve born of mounting peril, the machinery of prosecution now steering toward the Central Criminal Court and the decisive verdict scheduled for May 25, 1895. On May 25, 1895, at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, London's gas-lit, brass-fitted courtroom held a hush so charged even the reporter's pencils seemed loud. The gallery was full, newspaper men, society matrons, and a curious public. The press benches smelled of ink and anticipation. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde sat in the dock, pale against the dark wood, his once jaunty silk and waistcoat reduced to the costume of humiliation under the judge's steady gaze. The jury, after deliberation, returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of gross indecency, the statutory phrase that had followed Wilde since the Albemarle Club affair and his failed libel suit. The foreman pronounced the words that unmade his public life, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to tilt as a single gasp ran through the benches. The judge, invoking the law and public demands for moral firmness, sentenced him to 2 years' hard labor. The sentence landed with the austere clang of a jailer's key. Wilde's composure, so often theatrical and unflappable, finally gave way to a quiet, private resignation. Not even his wittiest epigrams could soften the weight of what he faced. Friends averted their faces. Patrons who had dined under mirrored chandeliers no longer met his eye, and Fleet Street's columns shifted from praise to the ledger of his disgrace. The conviction did more than take his liberty. It destroyed his household, wrecked his finances, closed theaters to his comedies, and branded his name with scandal. The sentence sent him into custody and set the arc that carried him through imprisonment from 1895 to 1897 and into the austere literary aftermath that followed. The conviction sent Wilde to 2 years' imprisonment from May 25, 1895 to May 19, 1897. He was moved from Newgate to Pentonville, then Wandsworth, and finally Reading Jail. The regimen of hard labor and daily humiliation in prison was eventually transmuted into austere writing. While incarcerated, he composed De Profundis, an anguished and candid self-reckoning addressed to Lord Alfred Douglas, written during his confinement and published posthumously in 1905. The next year, he published The Ballad of Reading Jail, 1898, under the signature C3.3, a bleak, resonant poem that turned prison suffering into public sympathy. Wilde was released on May 19, 1897, and went into exile in France. His career was shattered, finances ruined, theaters closed to his work, and many former patrons withdrawn. He lived in reduced circumstances in Paris until his death on November 30, 1900. Beyond his personal ruin, the trials exposed Victorian law and press intrusion, the Labouchere Amendment, the public airing of private letters, and the way scandal was manufactured. Those trials became a notorious emblem in later debates about sexuality, art, and privacy, and they helped set the context for gradual legal change that culminated in partial reform in 1967. Wilde's fall forces a hard question for posterity. What price should a society pay in scandal and silence to police the human heart?